6th March 1944. Dawn over northwestern Germany. The air above Münster is knife-sharp and blue, the kind of cold that makes metal sing. Contrails stretch like pale scars across the upper stratosphere. To the radar crews of Jagdgeschwader 26, it looks like another routine interception. On their scopes, a formation of heavy bombers appears to be withdrawing toward the North Sea. The Americans are pulling back early, an easy hunt. Orders crackle through radio static. All Staffel scramble! Catch them before they cross the coast! Within minutes, the German airfields come alive. Mechanics rushing, engines coughing, turbines shrieking. Focke-Wulf 190s and Bf 109s claw into the sky in pairs, climbing fast to 20,000 feet. Their pilots, veterans of hundreds of engagements, are confident. For years, they've ruled this airspace. They know how American formations move, how their bombers lumber and break. But this time, the pattern is different. To the east, 8th Air Force bomb groups are indeed withdrawing. But they're not alone. At 25,000 feet, escorting P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts drift lazily behind the bombers, throttled back, pretending to conserve fuel. Their task isn't to defend the bombers. It's to bait the Luftwaffe. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, leads the ruse. His pilots call themselves the Wolfpack, and they've spent weeks studying Luftwaffe habits. Their scramble times, their approach corridors, even how long German pilots could stay in the air before fuel forced them home. Zemke's idea is simple, brutal, and elegant. Make the enemy burn their fuel chasing ghosts. He knows the German interceptors always climb steep, hard, and hot, burning 40 gallons of C3 fuel per minute in pursuit of altitude. If he can drag them high, keep them climbing just a few minutes too long, gravity itself will turn into a weapon. The first part of the plan unfolds perfectly. German radar stations pick up the retreating American bombers, actually a smaller formation carrying radar reflectors to mimic a full fleet. The Luftwaffe scrambles more than 180 fighters from bases at Rhein, Osnabrück, and Paderborn. From the ground, it looks like victory forming in the sky. At 9:13 a.m., the first German fighters spot what they think is a straggling bomber group and dive. But as they close in, the cloud bank below them moves, or rather rises. P-47 Thunderbolts burst upward from the deck, throttles wide, guns hot. Above them, P-51 Mustangs drop from 27,000 feet like hawks. The Luftwaffe formation, halfway through its dive, suddenly finds itself bracketed. Heavy fighters climbing from below, escorts falling from above. The trap closes in 15 seconds. In those few moments, the old logic of the air war collapses. Dogfighting skill no longer matters. Altitude, energy, and radio timing do. A German ace later wrote, "We were falling into a sky that had already been planned." By 9:30, the air over Münster is chaos. Vapor trails twisting through fire, parachutes drifting down like torn paper. American pilots describe it as shooting into geometry. When the last German fighter breaks contact, 82 of them have been destroyed or written off. 22 U.S. aircraft are gone. The rest return home with empty guns and nearly dry tanks, proof that intellect can kill faster than bullets. That morning, for the first time, the Luftwaffe was not outflown. It was outthought, and from that day on, the air war over Europe would belong not to the fastest hands, but to the sharpest minds. Because in the war of the sky, the deadliest weapon isn't speed, it's timing. For years, the legend held that the Luftwaffe owned the European sky, that German aces like Hartmann, Barkhorn, and Galland had carved their names into the clouds through pure skill and machine mastery. Their Bf 109s and FW 190s were faster, sleeker, and deadlier. Their pilots, hardened since Spain and Poland, seemed untouchable. The myth was seductive. The lone night in the sky, the duel of skill over numbers. But by early 1944, that image was already dead. The Luftwaffe's kill tallies were history's most misleading statistics. German aces fought over their own airfields, against bombers forced to fly predictable paths. Each victory cost them fuel, altitude, and time. all of which Germany was running out of. The Americans didn't beat the Luftwaffe with better aircraft. Not yet. They beat them by dismantling the logic of the duel itself. When the first P-47 squadrons arrived in 1943, they couldn't outturn or outclimb the German fighters. They were heavy, sluggish at low altitude, and drank fuel like monsters. But they could dive, faster than anything else in the sky. And in those dives, pilots like Zemke began seeing a new kind of air combat. Not a duel, but a system. He once told his pilots, "You don't fight a German. You fight his pattern." By the start of 1944, the Luftwaffe was still fighting the old war, the one of reflexes and heroics. The Americans had shifted to a war of logistics and timing. The result was invisible at first, but devastating. Germany was burning more aviation fuel per interception than the Allies were losing in aircraft. Every climb, every scramble, every easy kill was draining the Reich's last strategic reserve, and the U.S. had learned how to provoke it. The 8th Air Force wasn't just flying bombing raids anymore. It was running psychological traps. Each mission was data. How fast did the Germans climb? How long could they sustain contact? How far from base did they disengage? The answers turned into algorithms, scribbled on briefing maps. By February, Colonel Zemke's 56th Fighter Group had started testing delayed drop-ins, formations that would appear to retreat west, then swing wide in a long arc before cutting back over enemy airfields just as German fighters were returning to refuel. It was warfare by rhythm. The Luftwaffe had the experience. The Americans had the math. German pilots believed they still ruled the sky. But in truth, they'd already been trapped inside the Allies' planning grid. Radar deception, false bomber radio codes, and weather manipulation, all pieces of a chess game invisible to the pilots themselves. The Americans had turned air combat into choreography, and while the Luftwaffe's veterans fought to maintain individual glory, Zemke's men fought as a system. Coordinated timing, altitude layering, fuel management, shared targets. Every pilot became part of an aerial equation. That's why the myth of Luftwaffe superiority collapsed so suddenly in 1944. It wasn't a decline in skill. It was the obsolescence of the duelist. Germany's fighter corps had been trained to hunt, to react. The U.S. fighter corps had learned to predict, to control. When those two worlds collided on March 6th, the Luftwaffe didn't lose a battle. It lost an era. Because the Americans didn't win by being braver or faster or luckier. They won because they made the Germans play a game that no longer existed. And when the Luftwaffe dove into the trap that morning, they weren't flying into a fight. They were flying into a plan. To understand how that single morning unfolded, you have to go back to the quiet revolution happening in Allied Air Command during the winter of 1943-44, a revolution of deception, numbers, and adaptation. By that point, daylight bombing over Germany had reached a breaking point. The 8th Air Force was losing planes faster than factories could replace them. In late 1943 alone, over 2,400 heavy bombers were shot down. Each B-17 carried 10 men. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. General Ira Eaker's strategy of unescorted precision bombing had failed. The Luftwaffe wasn't breaking. It was thriving on predictable targets. German radar picked up the bombers hundreds of miles out, and their fighter control system, the Jagdleitdienst, coordinated interception with mathematical precision. That's when Jimmy Doolittle took over. Doolittle's genius wasn't just courage, it was permission. In January 1944, he told his fighter commanders something no one had dared say before. "You are not to defend the bombers. You are to destroy the Luftwaffe." That single order changed everything. The fighters were no longer escorts. They were hunters. They would fly ahead, above, or even away from the bombers, using speed and fuel to control the Luftwaffe's reactions. And then came Colonel Hubert Zemke. Zemke, leader of the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, had been studying German interception tactics for months. He knew the Luftwaffe relied on rigid climb profiles and radar cues. Once scrambled, they were prisoners of their own efficiency. He realized you didn't need to fight them in the air. You could make them fight physics. Zemke began experimenting with what he called altitude laddering, stacking fighter squadrons at different heights, creating an invisible web across the sky. Some would appear to withdraw, burning fuel slowly, while others waited at optimum attack angles. When the Germans dove or climbed into pursuit, the trap snapped shut. To make the deception work, the Americans weaponized communication. They broadcast false radio traffic mimicking damaged bomber groups. Decoy squadrons flew without bomb loads, carrying radar reflectors to imitate heavy formations. German radar couldn't tell the difference, it only saw the signal strength. Meanwhile, Doolittle's intelligence officers fed the Germans accurate lies. Fake weather reports, altered flight plans, and bogus bomber frequencies. Each deception forced the Luftwaffe to commit hundreds of gallons of scarce aviation fuel, chasing targets that weren't real. And that's what brought them to 6 March 1944. That morning, while the 8th Air Force's main bomber stream struck Berlin, Zemke's group was assigned an escort corridor over northwestern Germany. But instead of escorting, they'd be baiting. A smaller Phantom bomber formation, only 18 planes fitted with reflectors, would appear on radar as a full wing of flying fortresses retreating west. The Germans, already exhausted from earlier interceptions, couldn't ignore it. They'd scramble everything left. And waiting below, beneath a low cloud layer, Zemke's Thunderbolts idled in silence. Their plan depended on timing, not seconds, but micro-decisions. If the Germans saw them too soon, the trap would fail. If the decoy moved too slowly, the Luftwaffe would conserve altitude. The Wolfpack was trained to think like hunters. No orders, no micromanagement, only signals. Zemke drilled them to move as a pack. One unit climbs, another dives, one holds back. In his own words, you don't fight them in the sky, you fight them in their head. That morning, he wasn't just leading a squadron. He was conducting a symphony of misdirection. When radar control in Germany announced American bombers withdrawing, it was the first note. When 180 German fighters launched in pursuit, it was the crescendo. And when Zemke's men rose through the cloud layer, throttles wide to meet them from behind and below, that was the final chord, the sound of intellect weaponized. This was the true birth of air trickery as doctrine, not brute force, not speed, not heroics. Just the simple, devastating truth that whoever defines the battle's geometry wins it. For every kill that morning, there was a calculation behind it, a set of invisible numbers written into the sky. The 56th Fighter Group's trap wasn't luck. It was math, executed at 25,000 feet. Start with fuel. The Luftwaffe's main fighters in 1944, the Bf-109G and the FW-190A, were deadly but thirsty. A standard intercept climb to 20,000 feet burned 240 liters of C3 fuel, nearly a quarter of their onboard supply. Every minute spent searching at high altitude cost another 25 liters. Their endurance window was just 70 minutes total. Zemke's Thunderbolts carried nearly 3 times that. 305 gallons, 1,150 liters, plus drop tanks. That meant they could loiter, feint, and wait. Time itself became a weapon. Zemke had studied Luftwaffe patterns. Interceptors, typically launched from Münster, climbed at a 17-degree angle, hit the bomber stream between 8 and 12 minutes after takeoff, fought for 5 minutes, then had to break off or risk running dry. That gave them maybe 15 minutes of combat before the laws of physics forced retreat. He called it the math of exhaustion. If he could delay them by even 3 minutes, force them to climb a little too far, turn a little too wide, the Luftwaffe's vaunted aggressiveness would become self-destruction. Now, add radar deception. Allied planners discovered that a formation of just 18 radar reflector-equipped bombers could mimic the radar signature of an entire wing of 200 flying fortresses. The Luftwaffe's radar operators couldn't distinguish between the two. They only saw the reflection strength. That's what baited the Germans on March 6th. A decoy bomber stream appeared retreating northwest. It wasn't a ghost. It was a calculated reflection, positioned to appear vulnerable. When German radar control at Stade and Rhine ordered a full scramble, it set off a chain reaction that burned nearly 12,000 liters of fuel per minute across multiple airfields. Each minute in the air was one less sortie later that day. Timing made it lethal. Zemke's fighters were divided into steps, altitude layers designed to manipulate climb paths. His top section, the cutters, flew at 27,000 feet, ready to swoop down. The mid-layer, the anchors, loitered around 22,000. The lowest, baiters, flew at 17,000, visible, retreating, pretending to be spent. The Luftwaffe dove straight into it. German 109s entered from above, accelerating past 400 materials, burning more than 45 liters of fuel every 60 seconds in a high-speed dive. They expected the Americans to scatter. Instead, the baiters pulled level and kept running. At that moment, the math flipped. A 109 diving loses altitude faster than it gains closure. In 15 seconds, they were trapped. Thunderbolts rising below, Mustangs dropping from above. The kill zone wasn't a random meeting. It was an engineered funnel no wider than a few kilometers, with no exit vectors except down. The result was brutal. In 7 minutes of combat, the Luftwaffe lost 82 aircraft. The Americans lost 22. Statistically, that's a 3.7 to 1 exchange ratio. But the true loss was strategic. The Germans burned more fuel that morning than they produced in a week. One U.S. intelligence officer later wrote, "We didn't win the air war by shooting them down. We won it by making them fly." The trap had done exactly that. It forced the Luftwaffe to act against its own logistics, to trade altitude for annihilation. Even the German flight controllers realized too late. Their radar showed one massive return fading west, and a dozen smaller ones vanishing south. To them, it looked like retreat. In truth, those smaller returns were the Wolfpack, waiting. Every detail, from cloud altitude to climb timing, had been pre-computed. Aerial warfare had become geometry in motion. When the skies cleared over Münster, the Luftwaffe hadn't just lost aircraft. It had lost its rhythm. The Americans had stolen it, quantized it, and weaponized it. And once timing becomes a weapon, no amount of skill can save you. Because math doesn't miss. At 8:40 a.m., Colonel Hubert Zemke throttled his P-47 Thunderbolt into formation with the rest of the 56th Fighter Group. Below him, the bombers looked like floating barns, dozens of silver dots moving eastward, glinting in the morning sun. Above him, the sky shimmered with vapor trails, the kind that reveal altitude to radar. He'd spent weeks preparing this, but no plan survives the first contact. His voice came across the radio, calm and clipped. "Wolfpack, spread formation. Baiters stay low. Anchors hold mid-deck. Cutters climb and wait for my mark." It was the aerial version of a chess opening. Each squadron played a piece. The baiters, flying lower at 17,000 feet, throttled back as if short on fuel. The anchors cruised 4,000 feet above them, close enough to seem like stragglers, but too far for the enemy to notice the pattern. The cutters were invisible at 27,000 feet, eyes scanning for the first black specks of interceptors on the horizon. At 8:58, German radar posts near Rhine confirmed what they thought was a retreating bomber group. Controllers shouted through static, "Jäger aufsteigen, attack before they cross the line. Fighters, take off now." Rhine, Gütersloh, and Münster airfields came alive. Mechanics yanked chocks, pilots clambered into cockpits still dripping with condensation. Engines roared. By 9:05, more than 180 German fighters were airborne, climbing in staggered waves. They were fast, dangerously fast. Focke-Wulf 190s climbed steeply, cutting through the upper haze. Bf 109s followed, lighter, more agile, the kind of fighters that had once shredded unescorted bombers without mercy. But they were already losing the fight they hadn't entered. The climb burned fuel. The pursuit burned more. From his cockpit, Zemke could see their contrails rising in thin spirals growing closer. His radar operator called out, "Contacts! 11 o'clock high! Multiple groups!" The Germans had taken the bait. "Hold course," Zemke said quietly. "No one fires until I say." The Luftwaffe dived. The lead German formation aimed for the lowest flight, the baiters. The P-47s below throttled up just enough to hold level. At that speed, the difference between pursuit and overshoot was measured in heartbeats. The German 109s came in too hot, their speed tearing away the element of control. And then Zemke gave the call. "Cutters, now!" The sky turned inside out. From 27,000 feet, Mustangs dropped like hawks, cannons flashing. The anchors rolled up from below in a synchronized climb, slashing across the German dive path. In seconds, the Luftwaffe was trapped between converging arcs of fire. No time to brake, no room to maneuver. Radio chatter dissolved into chaos. "Brake right! They're below us!" someone shouted in German. Another voice screamed, "Fuel warning! I'm hit!" The trap worked too perfectly. Zemke's Thunderbolt tore through the lower layer of 109s, 850 caliber machine guns spitting fire. He saw one fighter erupt in flame, its canopy tumbling away. A second later, a P-51 from the 355th Group streaked past, upside down, firing through a dive. It was over in seconds. When the fight broke apart at 9:17, the Luftwaffe's formation was gone. Smoke trails curved toward the ground. Parachutes opened like flowers. Zemke's group regrouped, counting the silence. "Wolfpack 1 to all flights. Check in. 2 here, 3 here, 4 here, 5 missing." He exhaled. 22 Americans down. But 82 confirmed enemy kills, more than any single morning in the European air war so far. One of Zemke's pilots, Lieutenant Joseph Powers, described it later. It wasn't a fight. It was like watching a trap door open under them. The sky folded in half and swallowed the Luftwaffe whole. The victory wasn't just tactical. It was psychological. The Germans had chased ghosts. They'd burned fuel, altitude, and time, the 3 currencies they could least afford. At 10:05 a.m., as Zemke's fighters turned home, he looked once more at the vapor-streaked horizon. Below, Germany's airfields were silent, their runways littered with smoke. He keyed the radio. "Wolfpack. Lesson of the day. Speed kills, but thinking buries it." The Wolfpack had outflown no one. They had simply outweighted. That morning, the Luftwaffe didn't lose to better pilots. It lost to better logic. When the combat reports came in that afternoon, Allied intelligence didn't believe them. 82 Luftwaffe fighters downed in under 20 minutes? Impossible. No mass raid had produced such a clean break before. The kill-to-loss ratio, nearly 4-1, seemed unreal. But the film reels from gun cameras confirmed it. The sky over Münster had turned into a firing range designed by engineers, not soldiers. For the first time, thinking had replaced fighting as the decisive weapon. Zemke's tactics became an instant case study in the briefing rooms of Doolittle's 8th Air Force headquarters. Charts of climb angles, fuel curves, and intercept arcs lined the walls. Officers drew chalk diagrams showing how timing, not thrust, had trapped the Luftwaffe. It became official doctrine within weeks. They called it deception-based engagement. But among pilots, it had a simpler name: the Wolfpack Method. The fundamentals were mathematical. Control the vertical plane. Force your enemy to climb or dive against his own endurance. Control the timeline. Make the engagement happen at the exact moment your engine performance peaks and his declines. Control the illusion. Make him believe you're retreating until his geometry betrays him. It was the birth of modern aerial systems warfare, decades before computers or radar-controlled interceptors. The 56th Fighter Group was soon tasked with testing the tactic across Germany. On 15th March, they repeated it near Brunswick. German radar tracked another retreating bomber wing. JG-11 scrambled. They were ambushed mid-climb. 48 German aircraft destroyed. By April, Zemke's Wolfpack had rewritten the rules. Doolittle himself visited their airfield at Boxted, England, to shake hands with the man who'd turned deception into fuel efficiency. Zemke didn't smile for the cameras. He just said, "They still think they lost to our engines." Behind the numbers, something deeper was changing. The Luftwaffe's pilots, once feared as invincible, began flying defensively. Shorter sorties, shallower climbs, more caution. Their confidence collapsed before their planes did. The Luftwaffe High Command knew it. General Adolf Galland admitted later, "We were no longer intercepting. We were reacting." They dictated the rhythm. That rhythm, the timing of bait, climb, and kill, became the new science of air combat. And the results were measurable. In the 3 months following Zemke's trap, Luftwaffe losses doubled. Their fuel reserves fell by 30%. Average flight endurance dropped from 72 minutes to 49. Meanwhile, U.S. bomber survival rates climbed 18%. That's what happens when data meets instinct. The Wolfpack didn't just shoot down planes. They dismantled an enemy's predictability. Every engagement added to the statistical model of German response time, climb rate, and refueling cycle. The Allies had turned dogfighting into probability. Zemke's after-action report was short, almost dismissive. Enemy fell into bait pattern. Altitude differential achieved. Fuel exhaustion exploited. Engagement terminated. It read like a formula. Because that's what it was. A new kind of warfare where emotion had no place, only timing. Historians later called it the day that air combat crossed a threshold. From heroics to logic, from duels to data. In the words of one of Zemke's pilots, "We stopped fighting pilots and started fighting physics." That morning, the Luftwaffe didn't just lose planes, it lost initiative, the most irreplaceable resource in war. From that day on, the Germans were always responding to the enemy's plan. And that's the most efficient kill of all. When the enemy never realizes the battle has already been decided. The trap over Münster wasn't just an ambush, it was the prototype of modern air control. The moment deception evolved into doctrine. And it all began with a single illusion. A retreat that wasn't. In the days after March 6th, the 56th Fighter Group returned to their airfield at Boxted, looking less like combat pilots and more like mathematicians with wings. Every gun camera reel was studied frame by frame. Zemke and his intelligence officers turned the footage into data. Timing of merges, dive angles, reaction intervals. Even the duration between German tracers and throttle bursts. This was the logic of the Wolfpack, an understanding that the human mind, not the machine, determined the outcome long before the first burst of fire. Zemke gathered his squadron leaders in the ready room, the air still thick with tobacco smoke and burnt oil, and drew 3 intersecting arcs on the board. "This," he said, tapping the middle, "is where their climb curve meets our fuel curve. You don't fight them before it. You don't chase them after. You wait for them here." The men nodded. They were beginning to grasp the underlying rhythm. Each mission wasn't just flight. It was choreography. Altitude, speed, and energy had to move like a conductor leading an orchestra. Zemke's Thunderbolts weren't designed for elegance. They were designed for survivability. But in formation, they became a single thinking entity, climbing, feinting, striking. Lieutenant Oscar Francis, one of Zemke's youngest pilots, described it later. "He taught us to feel the tempo. The Germans flew emotion. We flew equations." Zemke emphasized silence on the radio. No panic, no chatter, no heroics. In the Wolfpack, radio time was measured like oxygen. You spoke when the geometry changed, and not a second before. Their maneuvers became mechanical precision. Anchor arcs, cut angles, step rises. Each one timed to coincide with German visual ranges. The Luftwaffe pilots still flew individually. The Wolfpack flew collectively. It was the end of the lone ace era. The old romantic image of one-on-one duels evaporated in the contrails. No single man could outthink a synchronized group acting as one. Zemke's philosophy bled into every corner of U.S. fighter doctrine. He stopped calling his pilots flyers. He called them operators. His notes from that period read like a hybrid of combat manual and engineering sketchbook. Enemy climb rate, 109 G. 3,400 FPM at 240 mph. P-47 optimum intercept rate, 2,600 FPM at 275 mph. Average German visual detection, 8 seconds at 1.5 miles. Reaction time, 2.2 seconds. He calculated those numbers the way an artillery officer plots shell impacts. To him, combat wasn't art, it was arithmetic. That logic spread quickly. Other fighter groups began imitating the method, stacking altitudes, using fake retreats, coordinating multiple levels of engagement. Some called it Zemke's grid. The results were undeniable. Losses plummeted. Efficiency soared. But there was another layer to Wolfpack logic, the psychological one. Zemke understood that war isn't won only by destruction, but by confusion. He taught his men to act weak, to appear lost, to broadcast hesitation. It forced the Luftwaffe to overcommit. He used simplicity as misdirection, a trick that worked because no one expected the Americans to think that way. In one mission over Bremen, his formation let a group of FW-190s approach head-on, seemingly unaware. The Germans accelerated for the kill, only to find the Wolfpack splitting in two, one half climbing, one half diving, their firing arcs converging perfectly on the attackers. The engagement lasted 90 seconds, 8 kills, 0 losses. After that, pilots began calling their tactics geometric hunting. The Wolfpack had turned deception into doctrine and doctrine into rhythm. In Zemke's words, altitude is armor, timing is ammunition, the rest is noise. That's what made him different from every ace before him. He wasn't trying to outfly his enemy. He was trying to outpredict him. He once told a war correspondent, "We don't shoot Germans, we shoot patterns." That morning over Münster had proven his thesis beyond doubt. The Luftwaffe still had aces. The Americans now had algorithms. And for the rest of the war, the Wolfpack's logic would echo across the skies of Europe, a silent testament to the day cunning replaced courage as the deadliest weapon of all. At Rhine, the air was heavy with the smell of burned fuel and disbelief. The Luftwaffe's radio operators had gone silent. Their screens, still glowing green from the morning chaos, showed nothing but static. In the ready room of Jagdgeschwader 26, Major Klaus Müller stared at his flight board. 22 aircraft scrambled, only 9 returned. The rest missing, down, or scattered across the countryside in pieces. The reports made no sense. The Americans hadn't attacked the airfields. The interceptors had gone hunting, as they always did, chasing what appeared to be retreating bombers. And then, confusion, radio cutouts, screaming static, and silence. To the German pilots who survived, it felt less like a battle and more like falling into an invisible machine. Oberleutnant Franz Helbig, one of the few to make it back, described it later. "We saw the bombers below turning west, easy prey. I told my men to dive. Then the sky changed. There were flashes above and behind us. They were waiting. I realized too late we were inside their geometry." Another, Hauptmann Heinz Baer, called it, "The first time I saw us outthought, not outgunned." The Luftwaffe had relied for years on a flawless choreography. Radar detection, scramble, climb, intercept, kill. It was the best air defense system in the world, until that morning, when the Americans broke its rhythm. German radar stations had been deceived by the decoy formation. Their operators logged the targets as a withdrawing bomber wing. They didn't notice the smaller signatures circling below the clouds, Zemke's anchors. By the time JG-26 and JG-11 reached altitude, their climb paths intersected directly above those hidden fighters. The Americans had mapped the intercept corridor like a mathematical ambush. What made it worse was fuel. The Bf-109G's Daimler-Benz engine guzzled C-3 aviation fuel at 240 liters per 10 minutes of climb. By the time the Germans reached 22,000 feet, many had already burned half their supply. When the Americans appeared above them, the Luftwaffe pilots didn't just face surprise. They faced the math of gravity and endurance. They couldn't climb, couldn't run, couldn't dive fast enough. One German pilot's diary entry recovered after the war reads, "They let us think we were the hunters, but they were the ones circling. We didn't fall for a trick. We fell into a calculation." From the ground, Luftwaffe controllers watched helplessly as formation markers blinked off their scopes. They sent frantic messages, "Maintain altitude, do not pursue." But by then, fuel warnings were flashing in cockpits. Pilots who tried to disengage found their escape routes blocked by climbing Thunderbolts. For years, German training emphasized instinct, the pilot as hunter, the duel as personal combat. That morning, instinct became liability. The American system weaponized predictability itself. Within hours, the loss reports arrived at command headquarters. 82 aircraft destroyed, dozens more damaged or crash-landed. Many pilots never made it back at all, not from wounds, but from empty tanks. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland received the summary that evening. His handwritten note in the margin was short. "We no longer control the sky. The enemy controls time." The truth was devastating. The Luftwaffe had not lost to superior aircraft. The P-47 was heavier and slower than the FW-190. They hadn't lost to numbers. The Americans were outnumbered 2-1. They lost to planning. To a generation of German pilots raised on the gospel of the ace, that was the hardest truth to accept. Skill and bravery had once been the Luftwaffe's currency. Now, they were bankrupt. The following week, JG-26 flew only half its normal sorties. Fuel restrictions grounded half the group. Mechanics stripped wrecks for usable engines. And for the first time, pilots began to express fear. Not of dying, but of irrelevance. As one of them wrote bitterly in a letter home, "The Americans don't fight us anymore. They calculate us." From that morning on, the Luftwaffe never recovered its confidence. It could still fight, but never dictate. The war in the air had turned from a contest of reflexes into one of algorithms. And Germany, the inventor of blitzkrieg, had just been blitzed by its own idea. Speed without thought. That day, the hunters had become prey. Not because they flew worse, but because someone, somewhere, had understood the math of their instincts better than they did themselves. When the air war historians look back on March 6, 1944, they rarely list it among the great battles. It wasn't Berlin. It wasn't Schweinfurt. No famous general claimed it. No newspaper carried it on the front page. But inside the quiet mathematics of the war, that morning was the moment the Luftwaffe began to die. Not from bullets, not from fire, from thought. Before that day, the Germans still believed they could win through superiority of skill and experience. After that day, the sky belonged to whoever could predict first. The numbers proved it brutally. Luftwaffe fighter losses in 1943 had averaged around 350 per month. After March 1944, the number doubled. By June, it exceeded 800. German production couldn't keep up. Pilots were rushed through training with barely 60 hours of flight time before facing battle. The veterans who survived Münster wrote in their reports, "We are chasing ghosts." And that was exactly what Zemke and Doolittle wanted. Because the victory wasn't about that single ambush. It was about rhythm, the invisible pulse of a system built to force the enemy to act wrong. The Luftwaffe still flew, still fought, but now it fought against itself. Every time they scrambled, they burned fuel faster than they could replace it. Every time they took off, the Americans were already there, waiting inside the geometry of their climb. The trap that morning was a prototype for a new kind of war, a war of timing, computation, and prediction. The fighter pilot had evolved from duelist to operator, from artist to algorithm. Colonel Zemke, interviewed months later, said it plainly. They were the better flyers, we were the better thinkers. That's what ended the myth of German air superiority. Not an aircraft, not a single battle, a shift in mentality. The old Luftwaffe ace system, the cult of the lone hunter, could not survive a battlefield that demanded systems thinking. Against the Wolfpack, individuality was a liability. The Americans had industrialized cunning. Every engagement became data. Altitude ratios, fuel curves, visual range probabilities. The Air Force turned human perception into a weapon. When the next generation of radar and intercept systems appeared, they didn't replace the pilot. They merely automated his brain. And it all began here, in a 7-minute deception over northern Germany. That's why historians later called it the inflection point. It wasn't when the Allies won the air war. It was when they stopped losing it. The Luftwaffe never regained its balance. Even Adolf Galland, the proud ace who had once mocked Allied pilots, admitted after the war, "We lost not when they outnumbered us, but when they outthought us. We were trapped inside their plan, and we never escaped it." The logic was brutal. For the Luftwaffe, the sky had always been about performance. For the Americans, it became about prediction. The duel had evolved into a system, and systems always crush individuals in the end. The lesson of that morning was clear and merciless. Speed fades, skill decays. But timing can kill forever. The Luftwaffe had fought with muscle memory. The Americans fought with foresight. And when the smoke cleared over Münster, the future of air combat had arrived. Cold, calculated, invisible. It wasn't the roar of engines that decided it. It was the quiet math behind them. That day, thinking beat skill. And the Luftwaffe, for all its talent and glory, never caught up again. By the summer of 1944, the war above Europe no longer looked like the one that had begun. Gone were the duels between aces, the elegant arcs of one-on-one combat, the poetic notion of knights of the air. The sky had turned into an operating system, run by men who thought in vectors and fuel rates. Colonel Hubert Zemke never called himself a genius. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing efficiency, and that made him far more dangerous. His Wolfpack Method spread quietly across Allied air commands, changing how every mission was planned. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a grid, and that grid killed faster than any single pilot ever could. What happened over Münster that morning wasn't a fluke. It was the first full execution of a new kind of warfare. Every climb, every decoy, every feint had been calculated to weaponize time itself. The Luftwaffe had been fighting to intercept planes. The Americans had been fighting to intercept decisions. That's why, after March 6th, Germany's aces no longer mattered. They could still outfly anyone in the world, but they couldn't outthink a system designed to erase instinct. Zemke's after-action note summed it up with eerie simplicity. Deception works best when it looks like weakness. That principle would go on to define not just air combat, but all modern warfare. Radar traps, ECM, stealth design, all born from the logic that what you see is what you're meant to see. The Luftwaffe never recovered. By the time Allied bombers hit Berlin again in April, German radar screens were filled with ghosts, false returns, phantom formations, and electronic shadows. They were fighting illusions projected by a mind they could no longer predict. That morning in March was the hinge between eras, the last stand of intuition and the first victory of computation. Years later, when asked what he thought about the Luftwaffe's legendary pilots, Zemke said quietly, "They were magnificent, but they were still reacting. You can't win by reacting." He was right. War had changed shape. No longer a contest of courage, but of cognition. Not the sharpest turn, but the sharpest thought. And in that shift, that subtle, merciless transition, lay the real story of the air war. The 56th Fighter Group didn't just win a morning. They rewrote the physics of combat. The Luftwaffe had entered the day with arrogance, experience, and speed. They left it outmaneuvered, out-timed, and outsmarted. The lesson endures in every generation of pilots who've come since. Altitude isn't safety. Speed isn't victory. Timing is everything. Because when thought takes flight, the sky belongs to those who plan, not those who chase. And on that cold March morning, high above Munster, the Americans stopped chasing and made the Luftwaffe do it instead. That's how the age of air duels ended. Not with a roar, but with a calculation. And that's how one morning's deception became the blueprint for modern air supremacy. The sky from that day on was never free again.